High Admiral Ye Jin was sleeping in her command quarters when the emergency alarm started screaming throughout the Alliance flagship. She rolled out of bed and grabbed her uniform, knowing that nothing good ever happened, when alarms went off in the middle of the night cycle. The comm system crackled to life with urgent messages from across the galaxy. Earth was under attack. Zerion Prime was under attack. The Celestial Empire had finally made their move, and they had chosen to strike at the heart of the Alliance by targeting the homeworlds of the two most dangerous Deathworlder species. The energy beings had sent massive fleets to both planets, confident that surprise attacks would crush the Alliance before it could respond. Ye Jin reached the command center in less than 3 minutes and found organized chaos. Communications officers were trying to coordinate with defense forces on both worlds, while tactical specialists worked to plot response strategies. The holographic display showed the scale of the celestial assault, and it was larger than anything they had faced before. Captain Jin Ho appeared on the main screen, transmitting from Earth orbit, where he was commanding the planetary defense fleet. His face was grim, but determined as he reported the situation. The Celestials had brought enough ships to glass an entire planet, but they were discovering that Deathworlders had been planning for this moment. The defense of Earth was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The planet that had produced humanity was not going to fall without a fight. Hidden weapon platforms emerged from asteroid fields and moon bases. Defense stations that had been disguised as space debris suddenly came online with enough firepower to destroy battlecruisers. Combat engineer Teho was coordinating the orbital defenses from the largest space station above Earth. He watched through his tactical display as celestial energy beams struck the station shields. The weapons that had destroyed countless civilizations barely made the shields flicker. Human engineering had created defenses specifically designed to absorb and redirect energy attacks. On the surface of Earth, things were even more impressive. The Celestials had sent landing forces expecting to find helpless civilians. Instead, they found every human on the planet was armed and ready to fight. Children who should have been in schools were manning anti-aircraft guns, while grandparents operated missile launchers. The Celestial ground forces discovered that conquering a death world was different from attacking normal planets. Every building was a fortress, every street was a kill zone, and every human was a potential enemy. Even the wildlife seemed to be fighting against the invaders. Earth bears were attacking celestial war machines while human soldiers cheered them on. Meanwhile, on Zerion Prime, the Kragan response was even more brutal. War Chief Thektar had prepared his people for this day, and the entire planet had become a weapon. The Kragans did not just fight the invasion, they enjoyed it. Celestial soldiers found themselves facing warriors who laughed while being shot at. The Kragan civilians were proving to be just as dangerous as their military forces. Elderly Kragans were using mining equipment to hunt celestial war machines through the underground cities. Young Kragans barely old enough to walk were throwing explosive devices at enemy vehicles. The entire population had turned into an army. Pilot Ji-woon was leading a squadron of Alliance fighters through the space battle around Zerion Prime when he witnessed something that would become legendary. A group of Kragan grandmothers had somehow gotten into space wearing improvised armor and were using construction tools to tear apart celestial ships with their bare hands. The real shock came when the main Alliance fleet arrived at both battle zones. The Celestials had expected to face desperate defenders making hopeless last stands. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by an armada that had been waiting for this moment. The Deathworlder Alliance had been preparing for war while the energy beings had been making speeches. The combined fleet was a sight that terrified even the Celestials. Human ships, with their adaptive designs, worked alongside Kragan vessels that looked like flying fortresses. Vorthak fighters danced through space, while Gorlan heavy cruisers absorbed enemy fire and kept advancing. The Alliance had become a war machine that fed on violence. Fleet Admiral Kyung-soo commanded the main battle group and watched as Alliance tactics turned the tide of battle. The Celestials had superior numbers and technology, but they had never faced enemies who got stronger when things looked hopeless. Deathworlder crews were actually excited to be in the biggest fight of their lives. The battle around Earth became a massacre, but not the kind the Celestials had planned. Human and Kragan forces worked together using tactics that no civilized species would ever consider. They used their own ships as weapons, ramming enemy vessels and boarding actions that turned into hand-to-hand combat in the vacuum of space. The celestial commanders were experiencing something they had not felt in thousands of years: genuine fear. Their forces were not just being defeated, they were being slaughtered by creatures that should have been primitive savages, energy beings who had ruled the galaxy for millennia, were running away from humans and Kragans who were having fun. The turning point came when Alliance forces captured several celestial command ships intact. For the first time in galactic history, the energy beings were taken prisoner. The psychological impact was enormous across the galaxy as news spread that the gods could be defeated, captured, and interrogated. Dr. So Young led the interrogation teams and discovered information that changed everything. The Celestials were not immortal energy beings, they were just very old creatures who had learned to transfer their consciousness into energy forms. Their technology was advanced, but it had weaknesses that could be exploited. The captured Celestials revealed the location of key enemy installations, and the Alliance immediately began planning counterattacks. The energy beings had expected to crush the Deathworlder Alliance in a single decisive battle. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. News of the victory spread throughout the galaxy, faster than the speed of light. Species that had lived in fear of the Celestials for generations suddenly realized that their so-called gods could be beaten. The psychological impact was devastating to the Celestial Empire as rebellions began breaking out on occupied worlds. The Galactic Council found themselves dealing with a crisis they had not anticipated. The Deathworlder Alliance had not only survived the celestial attack, they had turned it into a crushing victory. Council members who had been secretly supporting the energy beings were now desperately trying to switch sides. Intelligence reports flooded in, showing that the Celestial Empire was in chaos. Their military forces were retreating from positions they had held for centuries, while their political structure began collapsing. Worlds that had been under celestial control for thousands of years were declaring independence. High. Admiral Yejin stood on the bridge of her flagship looking out at the wreckage of the celestial fleet. The Alliance had won their first major victory, but everyone knew this was just the beginning. The energy beings would not give up easily, and the real war was about to begin. The Deathworlder Alliance had proven that gods could bleed, and now every species in the galaxy was watching to see what would happen next. The Celestials had ruled through fear and intimidation, but the Alliance had shown that cooperation and determination could overcome any enemy. As rescue operations began on both Earth and Xerion Prime, the Alliance leadership was already planning their next move. The Celestials had made the mistake of attacking Deathworlder homeworlds, and now they were about to discover what happened when creatures from impossible worlds decided to take the fight to their enemies. Fleet Admiral Kyungsu stood on the bridge of the Alliance flagship watching as 3 celestial strongholds burned in the distance. The massive space stations that had controlled this sector for over 2,000 years were now twisted metal, floating in the void. 6 months after the failed invasion of Earth and Xerion Prime, the Deathworlder Alliance had become the hunters. The war had changed completely. The Celestials were no longer making grand attacks with overwhelming force. Instead, they were running scared, trying to defend positions they had thought were untouchable. But Deathworlders had never been good at leaving enemies alone, especially enemies who had tried to wipe them out. Strike Team Leader Yunji finished planting explosive charges on the main reactor of a celestial mining station. Her squad of mixed human and Kragan commandos had infiltrated the facility using tactics that would have horrified civilized military forces. They had disguised themselves as maintenance workers and walked right past security systems. The Celestials had never learned to look for enemies who did not follow normal rules of warfare. Deathworlders did not care about honor or proper military protocol, they cared about winning, and they were very good at finding creative ways to make their enemies miserable. The mining station exploded just as Yunji's team reached minimum safe distance. Intelligence reports were flooding in from across the galaxy, showing that the Celestial Empire was falling apart. The energy beings had ruled for so long through fear that they had forgotten how to actually fight determined enemies. Their military forces were designed to intimidate, not to battle creatures who got excited when shot. Commander Wu Jin was leading deep space reconnaissance missions into celestial territory, and what he found there was shocking. The energy beings were abandoning outer colonies and pulling their forces back toward the galactic core worlds that had been under celestial control for millennia, were being left to defend themselves. The psychological impact of the Alliance victories was spreading throughout the galaxy species that had never dared to resist. The Celestials were now openly rebelling. The energy beings discovered that their empire had been built on the assumption that everyone would stay afraid forever. But fear was a weapon that lost its power when people stopped believing in it. The Celestial Emperor sat in his crystal palace and felt something he had not experienced in over 3,000 years: genuine terror. The ancient energy being had watched civilizations rise and fall, but he had never faced enemies like the Deathworlder Alliance. They did not seem to understand that they were supposed to lose. Reports from the front lines made no sense to the Emperor. His forces were losing battles they should have won easily. Celestial energy weapons that could destroy planets were being absorbed by Alliance shields. Human tactics that looked like suicide missions were somehow working, and Kragan berserkers were literally punching through energy barriers. The worst part was that the Deathworlders seemed to be enjoying themselves. The Emperor had intercepted Alliance communications and discovered that human soldiers were competing to see who could destroy the most celestial ships. Kragan warriors were treating the war like a giant sporting event with prizes for the most creative kills. Dr. So Young had been analyzing captured celestial technology and making discoveries that shocked even her. The energy beings had been bluffing about their power for thousands of years. Their technology was advanced, but it was also incredibly old and had not been updated, because no one had ever challenged them successfully. The revelation that the Celestials were using stolen technology from extinct civilizations changed everything. The Alliance science teams began reverse engineering the energy weapons and defensive systems. Within weeks, they were producing equipment that could match celestial capabilities. The Alliance fleet was growing stronger with every battle. Captured enemy ships were being converted for Alliance use, while new vessels were being built, using combined Deathworlder technologies. The result was a navy that looked like it had been designed by creative madmen, which was probably accurate. Battle Group Commander Tae-Wan was leading raids deep into celestial space, using hit-and-run tactics that were driving the enemy crazy. His forces would appear without warning, destroy everything they could reach, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The Celestials had never dealt with enemies who refused to stand still and fight properly. Raids were revealing important intelligence about celestial infrastructure. The energy beings had built their empire around the assumption that no one would ever attack their core territories. Their defense systems were designed to repel invasions, not to stop small groups of incredibly dangerous commandos. Alliance special forces were infiltrating celestial research facilities and stealing thousands of years' worth of scientific data. The energy beings had collected knowledge from every civilization they had conquered, but they had never bothered to properly guard it. They had assumed that primitive species would never be able to use advanced information. The stolen data was being analyzed by combined science teams from all Alliance species. Human creativity was finding new applications for ancient technologies, while Kragan engineering was building devices that could survive being used by Deathworlders. Other species were contributing their own expertise, creating innovations that surpassed anything the Celestials had ever achieved. The Galactic Council was in complete panic. The Deathworlder Alliance had become the most powerful military force in known space, and they were showing no signs of slowing down. Council meetings had become emergency sessions focused on how to avoid being on the wrong side of a war. They had helped start. Diplomatic messages were flooding in from Council worlds, asking for Alliance protection. The same governments that had called Deathworlders primitive savages were now begging for help against celestial retaliation. The irony was not lost on Alliance leadership, who were being very selective about which requests they granted. Intelligence Officer Min Su had discovered something that made the Alliance leadership very angry. The Galactic Council had not just been feeding information to the Celestials, they had been actively helping to plan attacks against Deathworlder colonies. Council records showed detailed discussions about which planets would be easiest to destroy. The revelation that the Council had been accomplices in attempted genocide changed the entire political situation. The Alliance was no longer just fighting the Celestial Empire. They were also at war with the galactic government that had betrayed them. This meant that almost every major power in the galaxy was now their enemy, War Chief. Thektar addressed the combined Alliance leadership during an emergency council session. The massive Kragan warrior spoke in simple terms that everyone could understand. The Celestials and the Council had tried to wipe them out, and now they were going to face the consequences of making that mistake. The Alliance vote was unanimous. They would not stop with just defeating the Celestials. They would completely restructure galactic civilization to prevent this kind of betrayal from ever happening again. The energy beings had made the mistake of teaching Deathworlders that their so-called gods were just bullies. With advanced technology, strategic planning sessions were focusing on the next phase of the war. The Alliance had proven they could defeat celestial forces in open battle. Now they needed to find and destroy the source of enemy power. Intelligence suggested that the Celestial Emperor ruled from a hidden fortress in the space between galaxies. The discovery of the Emperor's location came from an unexpected source. A group of celestial defectors approached Alliance representatives offering to trade information for protection. The energy beings revealed that their Emperor had been hiding in a massive construct that existed outside normal space. The fortress was described as being larger than most planets and defended by energy barriers that could theoretically stop any attack. It was supposed to be the ultimate stronghold where the Emperor could rule in safety for eternity. But the defectors also revealed that the fortress had weaknesses that could be exploited. Dr. So-Young began working with Alliance engineers to develop weapons that could breach the Emperor's defenses. The project required combining technologies from every Alliance species and pushing the limits of what was physically possible. The result was a fleet of ships that looked like they belonged in a nightmare fleet. Admiral Kyung-soo prepared for the final phase of the war, knowing that the Alliance was about to attempt something that had never been done before. They were going to invade the space between galaxies and assault a fortress that was supposed to be impregnable. The energy beings were about to discover what happened when Deathworlders decided that nothing was truly impossible. The final battle was approaching, and everyone knew that the outcome would determine the future of galactic civilization. The Celestial Empire would either fall completely, or the Alliance would be destroyed, trying to reach their ultimate enemy. But Deathworlders had never been good at accepting defeat. 3 months after the historic meeting between Jinho and Thektar, the galaxy was about to witness something it had never seen before. Marine Sergeant Dong Min stood in the training yard of a hidden asteroid base watching human soldiers practice combat moves with Kragan warriors. The sight would have terrified most civilized beings, but to the Deathworlders, it felt like coming home. The asteroid base had been built in secret deep in the outer rim, where no Galactic Council ships would think to look. It was carved from solid rock by Kragan engineers who treated cutting through stone like humans treated slicing bread. The humans had provided the technology to make it invisible to sensors, while the Kragans made it nearly indestructible. Dong Min ducked as a Kragan warrior named Vexthor threw a practice spear over his head. The massive alien was trying to learn human throwing techniques, while Dong Min was attempting to master Kragan close combat fighting. The human sergeant had been knocked down 17 times in the last hour, but he kept getting back up with a grin on his face. The Kragans had been amazed to discover that humans actually enjoyed being beaten up during training. Most species would quit after the first serious injury, but humans seemed to get excited when they started bleeding. The Deathworlder mentality was becoming clear to both sides. The more dangerous something was, the more fun it became. Dr. So-Young worked day and night in the research labs trying to combine human and Kragan technologies. The brilliant scientist had been tasked with creating weapons that could actually hurt the Celestial Empire. Her workspace looked like a madhouse with half-finished inventions scattered everywhere and scorch marks on the walls from failed experiments. The breakthrough came when So-Young realized that human creativity paired perfectly with Kragan durability. Humans were excellent at thinking of new solutions to impossible problems, while Kragans could build things that would survive being thrown into a star. The combination was producing weapons that made both species nervous. The new battle armor was a perfect example of their cooperation. Human engineers had designed flexible systems that could adapt to different combat situations, while Kragan metalworkers had forged armor plating that could stop energy blasts from celestial weapons. The result was protective gear that let human soldiers survive hits that should have vaporized. Meanwhile, the armor gave Kragan warriors the speed and agility they needed to match human tactical thinking. A Kragan wearing the new gear could move like a human, but hit like a falling asteroid. The first test results had been so impressive that both species immediately ordered mass production. The partnership was attracting attention from other Deathworlder species across the galaxy. News of the human-Kragan alliance had spread through underground channels, and other dangerous civilizations were asking to join. The Galactic Council tried to stop these communications, but Deathworlders had always been good at ignoring official orders. The Vorthak were the first to make contact. These insectoid creatures came from a world where storms never stopped, and lightning was so common that their cities were built underground. Their homeworld, Zephyr Prime, experienced hurricanes that could flatten mountains and tornadoes that reached into space. Commander Nalvesh led the Vorthak delegation to the asteroid base. Her species communicated through clicking sounds that human translators struggled to understand, but the message was clear. The Celestials had destroyed 3 Vorthak colonies in the past month, and the survivors wanted revenge. The Vorthak brought unique skills to the Alliance. Their natural armor could deflect energy weapons, and their ability to fly made them perfect for zero-gravity combat. They also had technology for controlling weather patterns that could turn entire planets into weapons. Intelligence Officer Min Su was working around the clock to coordinate information from all the new allies. His communication center looked like organized chaos, with messages coming in from dozens of different species. Most civilizations used complex diplomatic language, but Deathworlders preferred direct communication. The reports Min Su received were both encouraging and terrifying. More Deathworlder species were joining the Alliance every week, but the Celestial Empire was also becoming more aggressive. The energy beings had apparently decided that the Alliance was a serious threat and were mobilizing their forces for a major attack. The Gorlans were the most unusual addition to the growing Alliance. These rock-eating creatures came from a planet that was literally trying to collapse into itself. Their homeworld, Petra Major, had gravity so strong that normal matter could not exist on the surface. The Gorlans lived in caverns deep underground where the pressure would crush most beings instantly. War Chief Gromdar led the Gorland contingent, and his species brought incredible engineering skills to the Alliance. They could build fortifications that would survive direct hits from planet-killer weapons. Their mining equipment could cut through anything, and their knowledge of defensive construction was unmatched. The Alliance base expanded rapidly as new species joined. Each group brought their own unique abilities and technologies. The Zephyrians could manipulate magnetic fields. The Pyrothians could survive in temperatures that would melt most metals. The Cryogens could fight in the vacuum of space without protective gear. Dr. So Young found herself coordinating research teams from a dozen different species. Each group had developed their own solutions to survival on impossible worlds. When their knowledge was combined, the results were revolutionary. They created weapons that used principles no single species could have discovered alone. The new Alliance fleet was taking shape in hidden shipyards throughout the Outer Rim. Human design philosophy emphasized speed and adaptability, while Kragan engineering focused on durability and firepower. The other species added their own specialties, creating ships that were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Captain Jin Ho stood on the bridge of the first completed Alliance vessel, watching construction crews from 6 different species working together. The ship looked like it had been designed by insane geniuses, which was probably accurate. Its weapons could punch through space station armor, and its shields could deflect attacks that would destroy normal warships. Intelligence reports were coming in that showed the Celestial Empire was getting desperate. The energy beings had ruled through fear and intimidation for thousands of years, but the Alliance was proving that their power was not absolute. The gods were discovering that creatures from Deathworlds did not scare easily. The Galactic Council was also becoming nervous. They had expected the Deathworlder species to destroy each other through conflict. Instead, they were becoming stronger through cooperation. Council meetings were now focused on what to do about an alliance that was growing beyond their control. Minister Haldrex of the Council sent secret messages to the Celestial Empire, asking for immediate action against the alliance. The energy beings were assured that the Council would provide full support for any military operation against the Deathworlders. This information was intercepted by Alliance intelligence and passed directly to the leadership. War Chief Thek Tar read the intercepted messages with growing anger. The Galactic Council was not just cooperating with the Celestials, they were actively helping them plan attacks against Deathworlder civilians. This betrayal went beyond simple politics. It was an act of war against every species that refused to bow down to false gods. The Alliance leadership met in emergency session to discuss their response. Captain Jinho argued for immediate military action, while other leaders wanted to gather more evidence. The debate continued for hours until Dr. So Young provided information that changed everything. The scientist had been analyzing celestial technology captured from previous battles and had made a shocking discovery. The energy beings were not as powerful as they pretended to be. Their abilities came from advanced technology, not divine power, and that technology had weaknesses that could be exploited. The revelation transformed the Alliance from a defensive organization into something much more dangerous. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were preparing to hunt gods, and the galaxy was about to discover what happened. When Deathworlders decided that someone needed to be taught a lesson, Captain Jinho pressed his face against the cold metal of the viewing window and stared at the strange ship floating in the darkness of space. The alien vessel looked like it had been through 1,000 battles. Its hull was covered in deep scratches and burn marks that told stories of violent encounters with creatures most beings could not even imagine. The ship belonged to the Kragans, a species that the Galactic Council whispered about in dark corners. They called them Deathworlders, just like they called humans the same terrible name. It meant they came from planets so dangerous that normal life should not exist there. Yet somehow these creatures not only survived, but became stronger because of it. Jinho had been commanding human Space Marines for 12 years now, and he had seen many strange things in the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His own ship carried 50 of the toughest soldiers Earth had ever produced, men and women who had grown up breathing poisoned air and dodging acid rainstorms, yet even his hardened crew was nervous about meeting the Kragans' lieutenant. Hyojin walked up beside her captain and looked out at the alien ship. Her hand rested on her weapon, but she knew it would be useless if things went wrong. The Kragans were famous for their incredible strength and their complete lack of fear when facing death. She had read reports that said a single Kragan warrior could tear through a steel door with bare hands. The communication system crackled to life and a harsh voice filled the bridge. It spoke in broken galactic standard, but the message was clear. The Kragan ship wanted to dock, and their leader wanted to meet face to face. Jinho felt his heart beat faster as he gave permission for the meeting. 30 minutes later, Jinho stood in the main airlock waiting for the Kragan delegation to come aboard. His Marines had taken positions around the room, their weapons ready, but not aimed directly at the door he had ordered them to be respectful but prepared for anything. The airlock door opened with a loud hiss and the first Kragan stepped through. Jinho had seen pictures before, but seeing one in person was completely different. The creature stood nearly 8 feet, tall with gray skin that looked like it was made of stone. Its eyes glowed with a red light and its mouth was filled with teeth that could bite through metal. Behind the first Kragan came their leader, War Chief Thek Tar, who was even larger than his companion. This massive being wore armor that looked like it had been forged in the fires of a dying star and carried weapons that seemed too heavy for any normal creature to lift. Jinho stepped forward and offered the traditional galactic greeting, a simple bow of the head. But before he could speak, War Chief Thek Tar did something unexpected. The massive alien began to laugh, a deep rumbling sound that shook the walls of the airlock. The Kragan pointed at Jinho and spoke in surprisingly good galactic standard. "You are the human captain they call Jinho, the crazy one. The one who flew his ship through a black hole storm to save civilians." Jinho was surprised that the alien knew about that mission. It had been classified by the Galactic Council because they thought it made humans look too dangerous. "Yes, that was me, but I had good reason." The civilians would have died otherwise. Thektar laughed again and slapped Jin-Ho on the shoulder with enough force to knock down a normal person, but Jin-Ho just grinned and stayed standing. Good reason, he says. My people have a saying about good reasons. They usually involve doing something that should kill you. The ice was broken, and the two leaders found themselves talking like old friends. They discovered that both their species had similar approaches to solving problems. When everyone else ran away from danger, humans and Kragans ran toward it. When others gave up and accepted defeat, Deathworlders found new ways to fight. Jin watched nervously as her captain and the alien warrior began sharing stories about their most dangerous battles. She noticed that the other Kragans and human marines were also starting to relax and talk to each other. It seemed that Deathworlders recognized something in each other regardless of what planet they came from. The real conversation began when Thektar mentioned the Celestial Empire. Both leaders became serious as they discussed the energy beings who claimed to be gods. These creatures had been hunting Deathworlder species for generations, trying to wipe them out. Because they represented chaos in the ordered universe, the Celestials wanted to create. Jin-Ho learned that the Kragans had been fighting the Celestials for over 200 years, losing entire colonies to their attacks. The energy beings would appear without warning, destroy everything, and disappear back into the void between stars. They seemed to have unlimited power and technology that made normal weapons useless. The human captain shared his own people's struggles with the Celestials. Earth had been attacked 17 times in the last century. Each time human forces had managed to drive them off, but the cost in lives and resources was enormous. The Galactic Council claimed they were working on a solution, but Jin-Ho suspected they were secretly helping the enemy. As the meeting continued, both leaders realized they had been fighting the same war from different sides. The Celestials wanted to eliminate all Deathworlder species because they could not be controlled or predicted. These energy beings had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years by keeping everyone afraid and divided. Thektar revealed something that made Jin-Ho angry. The Outer Dossier Galactic Council had been feeding information about human movements to the Celestials. They claimed it was for diplomatic purposes, but the Kragan intelligence network had proof that it was helping the enemy plan attacks. Jin-Ho felt his blood boil as he thought about all the times his people had trusted the Council with sensitive information. How many human lives had been lost because of this betrayal? How many Kragan warriors had died because someone was selling them out to their enemies? The two leaders looked at each other and both knew what had to happen next. The Celestials expected Deathworlders to fight alone, to be too proud and stubborn to work together. It was time to prove them wrong. Thektar extended his massive hand toward Jin-Ho. The human captain gripped it firmly and they shook hands in a gesture that would change the course of galactic history. Two species that thrived on impossible odds were now allies. Two groups of warriors who found joy in the face of death were about to become the Celestials' worst nightmare. The meeting ended with plans for a joint base and combined training exercises. The Galactic Council would soon discover that their plan to make Deathworlders destroy each other had backfired spectacularly. Instead of two dangerous species, they now faced an alliance that would make even gods nervous, as the Kragan delegation prepared to leave. Thektar turned to Jin-Ho one last time. The energy beings think they are gods, but they have never faced creatures. Like us together, they are about to learn that when Deathworlders unite, even the universe itself holds its breath. Commander In-Ho stood on the observation deck of the Alliance flagship and stared into the absolute darkness between galaxies. No stars shone in this empty void, and normal space seemed to bend and twist in ways that hurt to look at. The massive Alliance Armada was traveling through regions where no primitive species had ever been before. The journey to reach the Celestial Emperor's hidden fortress had taken 3 months of travel through dimensions that should not exist. Alliance scientists had modified their ships to survive in the space between realities, while engineers created navigation systems that could function where normal physics broke down. The fortress finally appeared on their sensors as a structure so massive it had its own gravity field. The construct looked like it had been grown rather than built, with crystal spires that reached into folded space and energy barriers that glowed with power stolen from dying stars. The Emperor had hidden himself in the ultimate Stronghold Captain Jinho commanded the lead assault group and watched as the fortress defenses activated energy barriers that could stop entire fleets snapped into place, while weapon systems that could destroy planets began charging for firing. The Celestials had built their ultimate sanctuary to be completely impregnable, but Deathworlders had never been impressed by the word impregnable. The Alliance attack began with tactics that would have horrified civilized military strategists. Instead of trying to break through the energy barriers, human engineers had found ways to go around them under them, and through dimensions the Celestials did not even know existed. The assault fleet appeared inside the barriers before the defenders could react. Assault Trooper Sung Min led the first wave of ground forces into the Crystal Palace itself. His mixed squad of humans, Kragans and other Deathworlder species moved through corridors that defied normal geometry, fighting energy beings who had forgotten what real combat felt like. The palace had been designed to inspire awe, not to withstand determined enemies. The fighting inside the fortress became legendary as Deathworlder forces proved that divine architecture meant nothing against enemies who specialized in doing impossible things. Energy beings who had not fought personally in thousands of years discovered that their godlike powers were useless against soldiers who refused to acknowledge that they should be impossible to defeat. The Celestial Emperor waited in his throne room surrounded by the most powerful energy beings in the galaxy. These ancient creatures had ruled space and time for longer than most civilizations had existed. They had destroyed countless worlds and enslaved entire species. Yet now they cowered before the approaching sound of Deathworlder boots. When Captain Jinho finally kicked down the doors to the throne room, the Emperor experienced something he had thought was impossible. A primitive creature from a backwater planet was standing before him, covered in battle damage but still grinning with the kind of crazy confidence that only came from surviving on worlds that tried to kill you daily. The confrontation between the Emperor and Jinho became the stuff of galactic legend. Here was an ancient being of pure energy who had shaped the destiny of civilizations, facing down a human marine who had grown up dodging acid rain and fighting predators that ate starships for breakfast. Emperor demanded to know how mere mortals dared to challenge beings who had existed since the dawn of time. His voice shook the foundations of reality itself, but Jinho just laughed and pointed his weapon at the energy being who claimed to be a god. The human captain spoke words that would be remembered forever. "We are not mortals," Jinho said with the kind of calm that came from facing death. So often it had become boring. "We are Deathworlders, and you just declared war on every nightmare your species ever had." The final battle was not the epic confrontation the Emperor had expected. Instead, it was a group of energy beings discovering that all their power meant nothing against enemies who had learned to survive by never giving up. The Celestials had ruled through fear, but Deathworlders had spent their entire lives learning that fear was just another obstacle to overcome. The Emperor surrendered when he realized that the Alliance forces were not going to kill him. They were going to drag him back to face trial for genocide. The energy being who had considered himself immortal was about to discover what justice looked like when delivered by species that had personal experience with his cruelty. War Chief Thektar personally placed restraints on the Emperor using devices designed to contain energy beings. The massive Kragan warrior looked down at the creature who had terrorized the galaxy for millennia and spoke with the kind of satisfaction that came from finally catching a bully who had been picking on smaller beings. The occupation of the Crystal Palace proceeded smoothly as Alliance forces secured thousands of years' worth of stolen technology and scientific data. The Celestials had been hoarding knowledge from every civilization they had conquered, but they had never bothered to innovate or improve anything. Dr. So Young led science teams through laboratories that contained the preserved knowledge of entire extinct species the energy beings had destroyed civilizations and then kept their achievements like trophies in a museum. The Alliance would return this knowledge to the galaxy and make sure it was used to help rather than harm. The end of the war came not with massive explosions, but with a simple announcement broadcast across the galaxy. The Celestial Empire had fallen, and the energy beings who had claimed to be gods were now prisoners awaiting trial. The Alliance had proven that cooperation was stronger than domination. Fleet Admiral Kyung-Soo addressed the combined fleet as they prepared to return to normal space. The Deathworlder Alliance had accomplished something that had seemed impossible. They had defeated beings who had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. But more importantly, they had shown that different species could work together. The journey home took them through sectors that were celebrating the fall of the Celestials' worlds that had been enslaved for generations were declaring independence, while species that had lived in fear were finally free. The Alliance fleet was greeted as liberators everywhere they stopped. The Galactic Council was waiting nervously when the Alliance Armada returned to civilized space. The same politicians who had called Deathworlders primitive savages were now dealing with the most powerful military force in the galaxy. The balance of power had shifted completely. Captain Jin Ho addressed the emergency council session and laid out the new reality. The Alliance would not be taking over the galaxy, but they would be making sure that no one ever again tried to commit genocide against species that refused to bow down to bullies. The terms were simple. The Galactic Council would be reformed with representation from every species, including those previously dismissed as Deathworlders. The celestial prisoners would face trial for their crimes, and their stolen technology would be distributed to help develop defensive systems. Most importantly, the galaxy would operate under new principles. Diversity would be celebrated rather than feared. Cooperation would be encouraged rather than discouraged. And any species that tried to rule through terror would find themselves facing the combined wrath of the Deathworlder Alliance. The transformation of galactic civilization took time, but the changes were profound. Species that had been enemies for centuries began working together. Worlds that had seemed impossible to settle were colonized by Deathworlders who turned challenges into opportunities. The Alliance maintained its military readiness but now focused on exploration and defense rather than conquest. Their fleets became the guardians of galactic peace, protecting weaker species from pirates, space monsters, and cosmic disasters. Years later, historians would mark the Deathworlder Alliance as the turning point when the galaxy learned that being different was a strength rather than a weakness. The energy beings who had once ruled as gods were serving sentences on prison worlds while their former subjects built new civilizations based on cooperation. Captain Jin Ho retired to a small colony world where he taught young officers from dozens of species the lessons he had learned during the war. The most important lesson was simple. When good people work together, even gods learn to be afraid. The galaxy had discovered that Deathworlders were not monsters to be feared, but guardians to be respected. They had proven that sometimes the best way to handle a god complex was to introduce it to species that specialized in making impossible things possible. In the end, the Celestial Empire fell not because they were defeated by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but because they had made the fundamental mistake of underestimating creatures who had learned that survival was just the beginning.